Hey, I'm Harrison Prentice, and for years I kept putting my dream of making music on the back burner. Then I decided it was time to stop waiting and go all in. That journey inspired my new song, Monsters. It's about confronting the fears, doubts, and inner battles that we all face. So if you've ever felt like you were carrying something heavy that no one else could see, this song is for you. Check out Monsters wherever you listen to your music and follow me on social media at Harrison_Prentice Music. Thanks for listening.
I sleep with the lights on these days.
He gave me a book on art forgery. I found myself drawn to these old masters. How did these artists take paint from a palette, arrange it on a canvas? I began to unlock the secrets. I was a storehouse of knowledge of how to create an illusion, present it to an experienced expert, manipulate his mind, and convince him and bring him to the inevitable conclusion that the painting is genuine. We flooded the market with my paintings, and I couldn't believe what I did. I couldn't believe it. Then the dominoes started falling, and eventually the FBI were led to my door. They uncovered a mountain of evidence against me.
But they never actually got you. At this point, you've sold a lot. You've got like $1 million in cash. You sold one painting for $717,000. Why did it go away? Why did you never get indicted? And how are we having this conversation?
I guess that's the greatest story of all.
To hear how Ken Perenni made millions in art forgery, dodged the mafia and the FBI, subscribe to The Jordan Harbinger Show and check out episode 282 in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is The Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to The Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my professorial co-host, Brett.
Oh, Alice, I did teach an evidence class once, so that's a good descriptor for me, I think.
You're okay, especially now that you do the podcast full time. I guess you could pick up another side gig, but good for you. The future of law students is not in your hands because we have one of the preeminent constitutional law scholars with us today. We have Randy Barnett, who's professor of constitutional law at Georgetown University Law Center. He's also the faculty director of Georgetown Center for the Constitution. But why you are going to be on the edge of your seat today is because he just wrote his new book, Felony Review, which is all about his time as a felony prosecutor in Cook County District Attorney's Office in the 70s and 80s. And you're not going to believe the stories he has to tell. Professor Barnett, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you, Alice, and thank you, Brett, for having me on.
So you actually are someone who doesn't need any introduction, but you've had such an incredible storied career, and we're here to talk about kind of the beginning of your career as a prosecutor. But before we get there, can you give our listeners just a little bit of background of why you became a lawyer, why you became a prosecutor, and then where you are today?
Well, I became a lawyer because of a television show that came on TV when I was 10 years old. I'm actually a child of TV. TV is still my favorite form of recreation. I watch, serious television instead of reading novels and things because I have to read so much for my work. But there's a show that came on when I was 10 years old. It was called The Defenders, and it was about a father-son legal defense team. It starred E.G. Marshall as the father and Robert Reed, who ultimately went on to be the dad in the Brady Bunch, as the son. And it was a very gritty, realistic depiction of criminal law practiced in New York, filmed on location. So it had sort of a very true sense of it. And I've actually watched it recently, and it still actually rings true. And that's what inspired me. That's what fired me up. I looked at the screen and I said, that's what I want to be. Now, at the same time, Perry Mason had been on our television every Sunday night. And that never made me want to be a criminal lawyer. Now, what was the difference between Perry Mason and The Defenders? Well, Perry Mason was about solving murders. Perry always caught the criminal. never defended anybody who was guilty except once at the very end of the run. The Defenders was about the practice of law. It was about being criminal lawyers and the ethical and moral questions that arise when you're doing that kind of work. That's what caught my eye. That's what made me want to be a lawyer. And I stuck to my guns, even though after going to Northwestern as an undergrad and Harvard Law School, at Harvard Law School, they pretty much do everything to push you in the direction of big law or something that's high status. And being a county prosecutor, which is what I really wanted to be, I wanted to be either a prosecutor or a public defender. And by the time I got to middle of law school, it was prosecutor. They try to steer you away from that. They steer you to big law. They steer you to clerkships. And I could not imagine that as the practice of law for me. And my classmates said to me when they heard what I wanted to be, they said, well, that's noble, but don't you think you might be wasting your degree? The wasting your degree syndrome. And my response was, I went to law school to do what I want to do. I came to Harvard so I could do what I want to do, not what I don't want to do. And what I want to do is be a criminal lawyer. That's to me what being a lawyer meant. Being a trial lawyer was what being a lawyer meant. And I'm just very proud of the time I got to be a trial lawyer trying murder cases to juries.
So the Defenders made you want to be a lawyer, but you did have to make that choice between, am I going to be a prosecutor? I'm going to be a defense attorney. And you chose prosecution. What was it that pushed you in that direction instead of going to the public defender's office?
There were a couple things, really. First of all, there's the different roles that defense lawyers have and prosecutors have. I, by my nature, am a constructive, glass half full, build it person. All my scholarship is about building a theory of liberty and justice and the Constitution and original. It's all about building a theory. Prosecutors build cases. That's what they do. They build. Defense attorneys, on the other hand, are critics. They tear down the prosecutor's case primarily. They're critical. A lot of law professors are critics and they can't build, and that's fine. You need critical faculties. But by my nature, I'm more in the builder and I'm less in the critical. And so that fit my personality better. The other thing that made a difference was the ethical obligations of the two roles. The defense lawyer's ethical obligation is to zealously defend the interest of their client. And without that, we would not have a functioning criminal justice system. So that is absolutely essential. I don't disparage that at all. But a prosecutor's ethical role is to do justice. And as somebody whose unifying theme of my entire career has been justice, whether that is philosophy or whether that is political theory or that's the practice of law, I like the idea that my job was to do justice, even if that meant not prosecuting somebody. And of course, Felony Review, the unit I was on that we'll get to, is all about not prosecuting people because the evidence wasn't there. And then I think the final reason was rather practical, and that is that the prosecutor's office, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, was at that time in Republican hands. A reform state's attorney, former FBI agent Bernard Carey, was the elected prosecutor. And the office was very non-political. And I had no political connections. And I could get that job. And I can talk about how I got that job. It wasn't easy. But I could get that job. And then I could rise through the ranks on merit, which is what happened. The public defender's office was still controlled by a Democrat. It was very patronage, like the rest of Chicago. And you needed political clout to get into it. And you needed political clout to rise within it. And that was too risky for me. And so for all those reasons, I chose prosecution.
And I really love what you said in there, seeking justice. And you don't actually disparage what public defenders do or what defenders do, because without them, there is not this just system. And before we get into this, you were driven by wanting to seek justice, by building cases. And you enter the Cook County District Attorney's Office in the 70s and 80s. Obviously now, in retrospect, we know what happened, that there was immense corruption there. But when you went there, what did you know about the office other than that you could rise on merit? Why did you choose to be that kind of prosecutor? We've talked about this and we joke about this all the time on our podcast. There are real prosecutors who are on the line and are at DA's offices. And then there are federal prosecutors. And then there's lots of other ways that you can be a prosecutor. But being an ADA in Cook County at this time, it's one of the highest crime areas. These are some of the grisliest, most devastating cases any prosecutor can face. Why here? And why is this the kind of prosecutor that you chose to be?
Well, Chicago was my hometown, and so I wanted to be a prosecutor. I wanted to live for the rest of my life in my hometown of Chicago, though that's not how things turned out for me, because I love Chicago, and I wanted to be a prosecutor in my hometown. So that was really the reason why I was there. But basically, you said, I want to be a real prosecutor. That's how I felt about it. I want to be a real prosecutor. Andy McCarthy, a former federal prosecutor, reviewed the book for National Review. And he got to that part of his review about how Randy wanted to be a real prosecutor. And in parentheses, he goes, ouch. So, yeah.
That's why I said it out loud, because I didn't want you to gloss over that. I absolutely agree with you.
Oh, you were absolutely in the trenches.
Right. So that's how I feel about it. And the other thing that real prosecutor metaphor did for me was when I was there, I'm very sort of intellectually inclined, scholarly inclined. I'd already published articles on criminal justice theory and in Ethics, which is a top philosophy journal, before I became a prosecutor when I was a law student. But I put that all aside because I wanted to throw myself 100% into doing the job and doing the job right, not be a dilettante, not be somebody who just came down and did it. Because in my head, my standard was, years from now, I want to be able to shake the hands of a prosecutor and say I was a prosecutor and mean that I really was a prosecutor. I just didn't hold the office. I actually did the job. And I did that. So that's what another thing about being a real prosecutor meant to me. Oh, and as for the corruption, that I was raised by a very realistic or cynical father who was a small businessman in Chicago and who knew all about corruption and told me all about it. I was growing up, I expected a corrupt system when I went in there. And the only pleasant surprise was that my own office was not corrupt. And that was a pleasant surprise. So actually, when I went in, as bad as it was cleaner than I thought it was going to be, because at least my office was not part of the corruption.
And I want to focus on that for a second, because I will say this. The book's amazing. People, Felony review, Randy Barnett, go buy it. I literally sat on my front porch to start reading it and just read the whole thing. It was just so compelling. And one of the reasons was this unbelievable fact is stranger than fiction level of corruption. And just the fact that everyone knew it. You knew going in front of that one judge with that one lawyer, you knew that lawyer had bought the judge. Like, you knew that. And you just had to deal with it.
Well, we found it out.
How did you do that?
We found that out in the middle of the hearing. We didn't know that until it was revealed to us. Now,
but you knew it from that point forward.
We knew it from that point forward. We knew by reputation that there were, who was the corrupt judges and who weren't the corrupt judges. And I'll tell you, the reputation was very accurate. Everybody, in fact, that was generally true. That's another, let's just deviate in this for a side issue. Sometimes I tell law students, you make a reputation when you enter into this business, and you keep that reputation. And those reputations tend to be accurate. So you really want to make a good reputation. And in my experience, people lived up and lived down to their reputations almost all the time. And that included the judges that were corrupt or not. Now, in this case, John Devine, the judge we were talking about, we didn't know he was corrupt. Now, we might have known he was corrupt if we knew that his nickname when he was a traffic court judge was Dollars Devine. If we had known that was his nickname, it would have been a tip-off to us that he was corrupt. But he had left traffic court. He was now the judge presiding in auto theft court. Auto theft court is the single court for the entire Cook County system, in which any auto theft in the city of Chicago goes through this court either for a misdemeanor prosecution or a felony preliminary hearing. So everything goes through that court, and he was in charge of auto theft court. And as you know from the story that you're referring to, he heard a chop shop case. And I'm going to tell you what a chop shop case is about. When people steal cars, they can't resell those cars illegally because they have vehicle identification numbers. You can't register them. So the way you make money on stolen cars is to break them up, chop them up for parts, and then sell the parts in used car in auto wrecking yards. And in Chicago, the auto wrecking yards are controlled by the mob. So the chop shop operations are also controlled by the mob. So somebody goes out and they steal a car, they take it to a chop shop, which is a garage behind some structure, and they get paid for it, and they go away. And now the chop shop guys break it up for parts, and that's distributed through the mob-run auto theft yards. So breaking up a chop shop operation is like a murder one case if you're working auto theft court. And so that's the biggest deal we've got. And they're complicated cases. There's lots of vehicle identification numbers involved. There's search and seizure issues involved. It's a big case. So this one case comes in. It's a chop shop. And my partner and I were handling this case in a preliminary hearing. And the judge, John Devine, had a rule that he would not hear motions to suppress at preliminary hearing. Now, there's no law that said he couldn't. This is just his practice. And he said, if you have a motion to suppress based on constitutional issues, raise it up at the trial court. My job's just to find probable cause. And that's the rule of the court. And so we put the cop, the arresting officer from an auto theft detail on the witness stand. And by witness stand, I mean, I think he was standing in front of the bench and we were standing in front of the bench. Nobody was seated anywhere. This is a really relatively informal court. And so we were examining him. And then that was the end. And now the defense lawyer named Eddie Jensen, who's now passed away, started cross-examining him. And on cross-examination, he started asking about the circumstances surrounding the search. And we objected, objection, judge, beyond the scope of preliminary hearing. And then the judge said, overruled. Overruled? What do you mean overruled? What? And now the cop starts revealing all of these facts that indicate that the search was of questionable legality. Something cops never admit to. If they lie on the witness stand, it's to make a search legal, not to make a search illegal. And so now the judge finds no probable cause and throws the case out. Well, my partner and I were both really outraged. My partner, Mark Riccozzi, who ultimately ended up being a judge, he walked in, back to our office, slammed his door, this big old door hard. And the judge looks at me with this shit-eating grin on his face saying, "Oh, I think my buddy's mad at me." But here's what we knew. We knew the cop was corrupt. That was obvious. But then we also knew the judge was corrupt because he had to deviate from his standard practice in order to throw this case. And so from then on in, we took precautions to avoid that from happening again. Now, I have to say, as I talk about in the book, I was so upset about this that I could not get my emotional equilibrium. I just couldn't. I was down in my office. It was a multi-story building. And I went down to my office and I went to my supervisor, Dennis Cooley, who was a former Chicago police officer and an experienced felony trial assistant who's now the head of the auto theft unit. And I said, "Dennis, I can't calm down. I cannot get unangry. I know this can't be right. This can't be healthy. If you can give me one reason to calm down, I think I can." And so he said, "Well, I'll give you a reason. The reason I'll give you is that if Eddie Jensen ever finds out that you have this attitude towards him, he's going to use that against you. Whenever you appear against him, he's going to say, 'Your Honor, the prosecutor's not making that objection because he thinks it's right. He's making that objection because he doesn't like me.'" And I said, "Thank you, Dennis. I think that'll do it." And I was able to calm down. And then I was able to not get mad, but then I was able to get even, as I talk about in the book.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies.
The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states. Guys, you may not know this, but I wear contacts, and I'm really bad about it. I wear them all the time. I sleep in them for weeks at a time. And eventually, you know what? My eyes start feeling not that great, and I got to wear glasses. But the problem is, the glasses I have are like 25 years old. And you know how it is. Even in 2026, replacing glasses feels like a whole production. So most of us just live with it. You got to schedule an appointment, you got to pay a fortune, then you wait. Well, our newest sponsor, Zenni Optical, fixes all of that. Zenni is an online eyewear shop. Prescription glasses, sunglasses, blue light lenses, starting at under $30. You go to Zenni.com, pick a frame, upload your prescription, and they ship it to your door. No appointment, no store, no upsell at the counter. I was able to get a pair of both prescription sunglasses and regular glasses on Zenni. It took no time at all. My daughter helped me pick out my sunglasses. They're these awesome aviators with these polarized pink lenses. They're amazing. I can't wait to wear them in public. You're going to love Zenni as much as I do.
And at that price, something kind of shifts. You stop asking, do I really need new glasses? And you start asking, why wouldn't I just get them? You're not agonizing over one pair that has to do everything for the next 2 years. Just get the ones that work. Get the fun ones. Get the pair that matches your outfit. At under $30, you don't have to justify it. Over 150,000 five-star reviews. And if you've never bought glasses online before, Zenni has a virtual try-on so you can see exactly how a frame looks on your face before you commit. I use this and apparently I need square frames. I loved it. I got to do it from my home. If your glasses are overdue for a refresh, now is the time. Go to Zenni.com/podcast and use code podcast15 for 15% off your first order. The styles sell out, so don't sit on it. That's Zenni.com/podcast. Promo code podcast 15. And you do get even, but so this is not just in hindsight, you realize there was fixing, that there was corruption. You knew it while you were practicing. And you said you took precautions and you had to continue to prosecute as best as you could in that system. How do you, day in and day out, make the decision to stay straight, as you say in the book, right? Because these are not decisions that you're usually not faced with one decision. It's many decisions over time. So you go on to say that most of the people you work with are incredibly honorable, despite being in a very corrupt system. So how do you, as the prosecutor, make the decision every day to stay straight within a system where you see obvious corruption before you and it affects the real cases that you're prosecuting?
It's really not difficult. There are difficult moral conundrums about being a prosecutor, but that's not one of them. Because if you don't want to be a kink, or which is what we call these corrupt judges or lawyers, if you don't want to be a kink, just don't be one. No one's going to make you be one. And I was never approached by anybody in the 4 years I was a prosecutor to do anything illicit because they knew that I was unapproachable. And if they know that about you, they leave you alone. But then there's this other practical thing, and that is that you don't need to bribe or fix the prosecutor if you own the judiciary and you own the cops. The idea is the cops and the judges, they go around you. We are trying to get in their way, but by and large, they didn't need to pay us off. I mean, I'm sure if they were corrupt lawyers, they would have, but they didn't need to because they had the judges.
So obviously Felony Review is the name of the book, and that's a formative period of your career when you're doing what sounds like the most interesting thing you could do as a prosecutor. Can you tell us a little bit about Felony Review, what it meant and what you learned in that role?
Sure. It's a unique system, which I think should be more widespread than it is. And that is that an agreement was reached between the elected Cook County State's Attorney, it was before my boss, it was Ed Hanrahan, and the Chicago Police Department, which is a different governmental agency. We're talking about the Cook County versus the city of Chicago. These have no corporate relationships with each other, but obviously have to work together. And an agreement was reached between the two departments that no Chicago police officer can bring felony charges without the approval of a Cook County State's Attorney, an assistant state's attorney. So as a result of that, a full-time unit had to be created 24/7 to be able to respond to police stations and evaluate cases by interviewing the cops, interviewing the witnesses, possibly interviewing the suspects if possible, and obtain confessions if possible, and evaluate the evidence to see if the evidence was good enough to go forward with a prosecution. And that meant this full-time unit had to be created. Our offices were in the police department area headquarters. We had our own squad cars. We did not go to court. It was a 12-hour shift, 12 hours on, 12 hours off. You had 3 days of nights, 3 days off, and 3 days of days before you switch back. And I was in this unit for 9 months, and it was the most interesting part of the job I did, which meant I was responding to crimes all over the city, dealing with cops, dealing with witnesses, dealing with suspects, and learned a lot that most prosecutors never get to find out about. I mean, for one thing, I got to talk to a lot of accused people and a lot of defendants. By the time somebody meets a prosecutor in court, they're represented by counsel and you can't talk to them. So most prosecutors haven't had any interactions with defendants, but I had lots of interactions with defendants, and I draw lessons from those interactions in Felony Review.
And one of the things you said about this Felony Review, we know what the trope is. Prosecutors are just there to get a win. But in fact, you detail in this Felony Review unit that many of the cases you reviewed, in fact, did not move forward with prosecution. So can you talk a little bit about that, what the stats were like, and why you wouldn't move forward with a prosecution during this Felony Review?
Well, sure. Well, it's because prosecutors want to win. They don't want to have bad cases. The worst thing that we felony review assistants feared ever happening was having one of our cases go up to the felony trial courts where we had not been yet. That is, we were on our way up. We were hoping to get there and have a felony trial assistant call down and say, why the heck did you give me this piece of crap? So because the prosecutors up there want to win. It's because prosecutors want to win that we wanted to screen out weak cases, which is really the way the system ought to work. So our approval rate was about 60%. Our rejection rate was about 40%. It was a serious review. And our logbooks, which I still have my logbooks, which is why I was able to reconstruct what I did on Felony Review, our logbooks were taken by our supervisors once a week, given to our clerical staff, and our stats were toted up to see if, in fact, we were rejecting too many cases or approving too many cases or rejecting too few cases. And so we were very serious about it. Now, it's also true that cops would sometimes bring us cases that they didn't think were strong enough, but they did not want to take the political heat or the personal heat from the victim or whoever and say no. They'd rather let the prosecutor take the heat for that, which is what we were there for. And so I wouldn't say every one of those cases in the 40%, even the Chicago police thought should be charged. But a lot of them they did, and they brought them to us, and it was their job to arrest. And it was our job to evaluate. And oftentimes this also meant, and this is a very important part of the job, it was our job to hold off approval until the cops did what we thought they ought to do to make the case strong enough to approve and go to trial. And so my job in the police station in the middle of the night, and some of the stories that I tell are about this job, was to imagine, to anticipate, if I were a defense lawyer looking at this case, what would I do with it? And then do what I could in the police station in the middle of the night to negate that. So it's sort of like being a prosecutor in the trial court, thinking back, because God, if I was only there in the police station and I had done this thing, then the defense couldn't have made this argument. And my job as a felony review assistant was to think like that and anticipate what a defense lawyer might do with the case and prevent them from doing it. And several of the stories in felony review are about my successful effort to do that.
That sounds just awesome. As a fake prosecutor, federal prosecutor, I would love to be able to do something like that. Number one, do they still do that in Chicago? And number two, is that a formula that's been replicated in other cities? Because it just seems like such a great way to screen out cases.
You would think that I would have looked into that by now, but I haven't. So I don't know how much it's done in other cities. I do think the felony review has been somewhat restructured since I was there, because I think they send experienced lawyers back to felony review, where they didn't do that when I was there. It was all lawyers solely on their way up. We had supervisors who were experienced, but we were all relatively rookies. We hadn't been to the trial courts yet. I do think they rotate people in and out of felony review now, which is also good for everybody. But by and large, I think the system is relatively unique. And I do think it's one of the best parts of Cook County justice, because what it means is that by the time a case gets to the felony trial courts, it's been seriously vetted and it's very strong. And that's why prosecutors win most of their cases, because they should win most. If they don't win their cases, there's something wrong with the prosecutor, because the case should be there when they get it. Now, it's true, cases sometimes look one way when the cases are charged, and then things happen. Witnesses disappear, witnesses change their mind. Things can happen later on. That's nobody's fault. But by and large, we're expected to win because we have the horses.
Absolutely. I mean, I love that kind of rigor that you do. And one of the things that I think is so unique, and you detail this in the book as well, is not all prosecutors get to visit crime scenes or see the witnesses in the first instance. Oftentimes we're dropped with a case file and then we have to reconstruct or fill in gaps that were there. Why didn't you talk to the girlfriend? What if the girlfriend says it's her car? That completely demolishes everything. What if they actually say that he had the gun with him, but X, Y, and Z? But you were able, during this felony review, to be able to go, and it sounds like you were hazed a little bit by the police as well, in terms of, taking you through some grisly crime scenes. By haze, I simply mean that they're shocking scenes to walk into that most lawyers sit behind a portfolio and read and don't have to see in person. But getting to see crime scenes, a lot of the investigation is right at your fingertips, things that are difficult to put onto paper. With that kind of visceralness, how did that affect the way that you then tried cases when you made it up to felony court?
I mean, I could picture what was happening in the police stations better. It wasn't like I wasn't trying to make it up from TV. I'd been there. I knew a lot of the cops. I mean, if a cop came up, I knew if these are one of the hot dog cops or one of the serious cops. There were different investigators. I mean, The Wire is the only TV show that really, to date, that really accurately depicts the criminal justice system. And if you'll notice the diversity of cops they have these cops, some of them don't want to do anything. And some of the cops, they're just waiting for retirement, or they're just lazy and they dress a certain way. But then there's other cops who are not. They're super sharp, super motivated. That's exactly what it's like. And so one of the things you get when you're a felony trial court is you have an idea who these guys are, who are the good ones and who are the bad ones. And that did affect it. As for the hazing, I think the one you're thinking about is when I went to a crime scene that was across the street from the station I was responding to, and it was about a husband who had stabbed his wife and who died. And so I got to, they said, well, the crime scene's across the street from I didn't go to the crime scenes very often, I should say. I did most of my work in the police station. But this time it was across the street. So they said, you want to go see the scene? I said, sure. So we walked up the stairs and this 3-story walk up. I get into the apartment and this unfortunate woman's body is laying on the floor at the foot of her bed. And this was in the middle of winter. So everybody had like boots on and I had boots on and there were a million cops and they were all stomping all over the crime scene, unlike what you see on TV. So I get into the bedroom and these 2 investigators are there. And one of them bends down over the body and looks up at me and he says to me, "Is it okay if we turn over the body?" And that was just, he was just breaking my balls because, I'm just this 20-something kid in corduroys and a sport coat. And so I said, yeah, sure. I said, yeah, it's fine. And so he rolls the body over and this poor woman's hand just falls like a thud on my boot, on my leather boot. So that was the one time they were hazing me. The other time that I wouldn't call it hazing, but this was a rape case, one of the very, very rare cases in which I went with my gut, because I actually tried very hard not to decide cases based on my gut, because I think your gut can be wrong as well as right. I basically based it on the evidence. But this in one case, I really believed the defendant and I didn't believe the victim, the complainant, who I don't think was a victim. And so I disapproved the charges. And I was in the far south side at this district court headquarters, and with me were the homicide sex investigators and the tactical officers who had made the arrest. And after I did the rejection, I had to fill out my paperwork before I could get in my car and drive back to my office. And I hadn't realized at the time, I hadn't noticed until I finished, that the homicide investigators had stuck around. They were sticking around. They hadn't left. And I only noticed that when I got up to leave, then they got up to leave. And then they walked me to my car. And then one of my jobs as a prosecutor, both then and throughout the entire tenure, was to figure out what the heck is really going on here. That's your number one job as a prosecutor, is to figure, in Cook County, what's really going on. So I'm thinking, what's really going on here? And I think what's really going on here were one of 2 things. One is they were afraid that the tactical officers who disagreed with the decision, the sex investigators agreed with my decision to reject, but the tactical officers did not agree. And they were afraid, I think, that these hot dog tactical officers, who are kind of macho guys, were going to somehow intimidate me or just persuade me to change my mind if they didn't escort me to the car. So they escorted me to the car to make sure I got off safely out of this district court and did not get harassed by these tactical officers, which I thought was interesting.
Just as I said, the book is wild. It's insane that some of the stuff you read about actually happened. I want to touch on what you just said about going with your gut, because we do a lot of these true crime cases and we'll listen to 911 calls or interrogations, and a lot of our listeners try and make a decision. They hear that 60-second 911 call and they're, oh, she's lying, or he's clearly telling the truth. And at one point in your book, you say something along the lines of, to paraphrase, you probably said it better, that innocent people are often bad at telling the truth and guilty people are often good at lying, and that it is difficult to tell whether someone's telling you the truth. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because you obviously heard a lot of lies and a lot of truths while you were doing that work.
I love a good bargain. In fact, it just pains me to pay for anything full price when I know that there are other options. Garage sales, clearance racks, you name it. I never walk away from a good deal. I grew up thinking that that's just what you're supposed to do, find good deals. Well, it turns out there are a lot of us out there. I found a designer bag on Whatnot for literally half of what it was going to be anywhere else, and it was still for sale at full price elsewhere. I got to watch the seller show it up close, ask questions about the condition, and buy it knowing exactly what I was getting into. That's the real magic of Whatnot, and why other apps just don't compare. Whatnot makes you connect with a seller so that you really know what you're buying before you buy it. On Whatnot, you're connecting with sellers and other shoppers. It's like hanging out with a group that gets you. This is a fun way to shop from the comfort of your own home on your phone. And you almost never pay full price. You can shop name brands across makeup, perfume, clothes, handbag, jewelry, and more, all without the retail sticker shock. And this is the best place to find great deals on products you love. I love nice clothes. I just don't like the price tag. I was able to jump on there because I had a wedding to go to recently and I wanted a new dress, but I didn't want to pay that full price tag. I instantly connected with other shoppers and sellers on beautiful dresses and was able to pick out a perfect outfit for this nighttime wedding.
And guys, it's not just if you want to buy. If you have clothes, bags, or accessories sitting in your closet you no longer reach for, Whatnot makes it easy to turn them into cash. Connect with shoppers who share your style and have fun going live while doing it. Download Whatnot today and get $20 off and free shipping on your first purchase. Search Whatnot, WHATNOT, in the App Store. Sign up and start finding the best deals on the products you love with $20 off and free shipping on your first purchase.
Yeah, I think that's true. You got really, really good liars, and you got people who get really nervous and they can't tell the truth very well. And so I think it's really a bad idea to try to go with your gut, because your gut is likely to be wrong. And really, our job wasn't to do that. Our job was to ask, is the evidence there for a prosecution? Our job was really an objective job based on the weight of the evidence that we had available to us. And so our gut would only get in the way of that. On the other hand, we did have that ethical responsibility to do justice. And if we truly believe, for whatever reason, that somebody was being wrongfully charged, it was our duty to see to it that they didn't get charged. And in fact, in the case I talked about of the husband who stabbed his wife, I disapproved murder case charges. He went free. He was never charged, and he never had to hire a lawyer, and he had never had to go to court, and he never had to confront the Innocence Project, because felony review is the original Innocence Project. He was innocent, in my opinion, and the evidence, I made the decision based on the evidence, and he never had to be charged because felony review is there to protect him. And I think that's the way it should be.
You know, another thing that you do really well in this book is you have these incredible war stories, but you're also very candid about mistakes that you made. We all make mistakes, and we've always said that this is the best justice system. I truly believe that. But it's a system made of humans, and humans make mistakes. And, you know, you now, in retrospect, can look upon your mistakes, but at the time, they could have seemed like devastating mistakes. You get overturned, you know, on appeal. No lawyer likes to be overturned on appeal. You make a mistake mid-confession that you realize. You know, these are things that could throw an entire case or really shake any sort of prosecutor or attorney's core. But you not only detail them in the book, you also talk about what good they did in terms of you growing as an attorney. More people need to learn that, and more people need to hear that. You know, in the moment, though, how do you deal with that type of, you know, for lack of a better word, failure, or what appears to be failure?
Well, I think that when you write anything, a memoir of any kind, and this is my second memoir, this is a specialized part of my life story that I segregated out to a separate book. My first book, A Life for Liberty, which is a book about, you know, the making of an American originalist is the subtitle. And it's a book about my entire career, how I became a constitutional law guy, which is what people know me as. I did the same thing. I talked about the mistakes I made, because I think to be taken seriously as the truth, that you can't be the hero in your own story. You have to be honest about what you did wrong and let the reader learn from your mistakes. I mean, that is really the point of it. It's to entertain, but it's also that young people, young lawyers, learn from the mistakes that I made and don't do what I did. And that's true career-wise in my other book, and it's true when it comes to being a prosecutor. And I made some really doozy of mistakes. And by the way, in terms of the reversals that I had, the one reversal I had, I didn't know about that till I was a law professor. So that isn't something that I found out about while I was in the prosecutor's office. But, you know, the one example you're giving is when I failed to give Miranda rights in the middle of a court reporter statement of a murder case. That was bad, but it got fixed. And the other one is where I had the single worst performance of my entire professional life, cross-examining a defendant in a murder case. The first time I cross-examined a defendant in a murder case, which I just completely blew. We won the case anyway, which shows how much it meant, but it was just humiliating how bad it was. And it took me months, because prosecutors rarely get that opportunity. It took me months to have a second chance, having months to think about what I did wrong and don't do that again. It was a very simple mistake I made. that I could easily not do again, but it took months to try again, and I did it fine the next time. So if you want, I can tell the stories of these two failures of mine and what happened.
I'd love to hear your telling of the Miranda rights one, because, that is something that we hear on TV all the time. And it is devastating because you're getting the confession. This guy, when you say 40% decline for prosecution, it's not necessarily that we're saying 40% didn't commit the crime, but the evidence doesn't support bringing charges. And so here you're faced with someone who is confessing to it. And essentially a procedural error could prevent the statement from coming in. So I'd love to hear from your words on how that came about.
Earlier in that case, the cops had arrested the wrong guy. And Felony Review made the cops go to the hospital for the surviving victim. I mean, it was a Korean liquor store owner and his wife who ran this store, and he was stabbed to death. And she was in critical condition, having been stabbed as well. And it's a grisly story about how she escaped. I didn't find out those details, by the way, until I wrote the book about how she escaped, because I found the newspaper stories, the columns that had been written about this case and her. I didn't know about that. So I did a lot of research on the cases I did to write the book, and found out I found out about a case that got reversed and then upheld by the Supreme Court doing research on the case. Anyway, the Felony Review worked because they had captured the wrong guy named Cesar, and then they went out when she failed to make the positive ID. Then they went out and captured the right guy. And I'm taking his confession, and I get to the end of the confession, and I always stopped. It was not a recorded on video. It was a court reporter statement. So you can stop and pause, and pauses don't get recorded. So you sit there and you take as long as you want to think about what I might have forgotten to say, or I want to say. And I'm sitting there thinking, I don't know that I gave this guy his Miranda rights at the beginning of the statement. I think maybe I didn't. Now, why would that have happened? It happened because I was doing that thing I told you about. I was trying to anticipate what a future defense lawyer would do with this case. We had the proceeds. We had an eyewitness testimony. We had the weapon. And I'm sorry, he was shot, right? And not stabbed to death. I made a mistake about that. He was shot. So we had the weapon, murder weapon. We had everything. What would a defense lawyer say about this confession? He would say, well, the guy was from Colombia and he couldn't speak English. And so the cops made up this confession. So how am I going to negate that in the police station? Here's how I'm going to do it. I had the police find a Spanish-speaking police officer who could be present during the court reporter statement. And then when I began the court reporter statement, I went on the record saying to the defendant, Cesar Marin, I said, Cesar, there is this officer here, Officer so-and-so. I gave his name. I said, he speaks Spanish. If you have any difficulty understanding my questions, or if you have any difficulty explaining your answer, please speak to him and he will help you. But that threw me off, because normally I would give my Miranda warnings there. But I had just given this made up, new, innovative admonition and forgot about the Miranda warnings. So I'm at the end thinking, I don't know that I did this. So I turned to the guy. I was training a guy as to how to do this job. I'm training him. And I turned to him. Jimmy Lynn is his name. And I said, did I give this guy his Miranda rights? I'm whispering to him. Did I give him? I think you did. Then I asked the police sergeant who was there, did I do that? I think you did. Then I asked the court reporter, did I do it, Emmett? He goes, I think you did. I'm sure you did, but I'll check. So he went back in his tape and he says, you didn't do it. Now I'm sitting there going, what the hell do I do now? And Jimmy Lynn, the guy I'm training, whispers in my ear how to fix it. And that is, I had given Cesar his Miranda rights before I took an oral confession earlier that evening. So he had been given his Miranda warnings. What I had to do is retroactively remind him of that on the record so that we were legal. And so I said, well, prior to giving me this statement with a court reporter, you and I had a conversation about this beforehand, didn't we? Yes. And before that conversation, I advised you that you had a right to have an attorney present. And I went through each one and he goes, yes. And I advised you. So I retroactively gave him his Miranda warnings. Now, I don't know if this solution would have occurred to me if Jimmy Lynn, was not sitting next to me and advised me to do that. James Lynn, by the way, went on to be a circuit court judge himself. And he handled some pretty big cases as circuit court judge. He's now retired, but he does give Felony Review a 5-star review on Amazon. And you can read his review on Amazon if you go on there right now. The other mistake I made in this cross-examination that was terrible, and it was a very simple mistake. I got up, and for personal reasons that I won't go into, but it had to do with my relationship with my first chair. I was the third chair in the courtroom, and I had a difficult relationship with my first chair. To prove myself, I got up, and I was like at 11. I just laid into the defendant. And that is simply it's not the right way to do it. For the jury, you have to start calm. You have to build up. And then when a witness gives you an answer that justifies a harsh response, then you pounce. You don't pounce from the beginning, because then you got no place to go. And I had no place to go. And once I'd started there, I was done. So that's why once I diagnosed that, months later, I got a chance to do it the right way, and it worked the way it should work.
And, stories like that, along with the other stories in the book. I mean, this book, it's riveting. It has, by the end, it's almost like a thriller reading through it. And the one thing, I think if you're a young lawyer out there, a young prosecutor, it's a must read book for some of these lessons. And we have a lot of those folks who listen to the show. And as we wrap up, because don't want to take all your time because you're a very busy, important person, much more important than our podcast. So we're very honored to have you. But we do have a lot of young prosecutors who listen to this show. And as you know, in this world we live in today, and maybe it's always been this way, everything's super political. Everybody's super political. You talk about in your book your sort of long-held libertarian views and how you dealt with those as a prosecutor. And there might be some people who are in the libertarian camp who don't understand how you could even do that. So can you talk a little bit about that and maybe give some advice to those young prosecutors who are listening?
Sure. Well, first of all, I have to say the book I'm currently writing, and I'm well along in writing it, is a reconsideration of libertarian first principles. It's a reconsideration of what it means to be a libertarian. The title of that book is Freedom and Flourishing, Libertarianism for the Real World. And so I do think some of what passes for libertarianism, in fact, quite a bit that passes for libertarianism, isn't really correct. And libertarianism really ought to be rethought in some sense from the ground up. I was a libertarian since I was in college, and I was very active in the New York libertarian intellectual movement when I was in law school and into my early years as being a law professor as well. And so I've been a libertarian for 50 years, but I do think the model needs to be rethought. Having said that, and I guess I should also say that part of the rethinking of that model has been reflected by my constitutional theorizing that I've done in the last 20 or 30 years. That has affected my view of what libertarian first principles should be. But now, having said that, when I was there, I was a conventional libertarian, and my view was again a commitment to justice, which is what has unified my whole career. And my belief was that if somebody had perpetrated this kind of manifest injustice on another person, something should happen to them as a result. Now, maybe what the system does is not the right something, but nothing happening to that person is highly unjust. And so my job was to make sure that something happened, and that something might have been, going to jail. So that was part of it. Drug laws were another part of it, which maybe is what you're alluding to, because I, at the time, and still believe that drug laws are inherently unjust and should not exist. And they are bad for everybody, bad for society, bad for individuals. I know that's a controversial view. It's a stereotypical libertarian view, and it's one of the few that I still hold, right? Just like that. However, when I was a prosecutor, for very accidental reasons, I never had to send anybody to jail for drugs. That was because when I worked drug court, which I was assigned to, the misdemeanors were handled by diversion because Bernard Carey, my boss, was very liberal on drugs. And the felonies, we had preliminary hearings and sent them up to the trial court for them to do something about. By the time I was a trial assistant, my boss had been defeated by Richard Daley on a tough on drugs campaign. He accused my boss of being soft on drugs. He created a new drug prosecution unit. They took all the cases away from the trial courts, so I never had to prosecute him when I was a felony trial assistant, although they ended up being so inundated by them that they gave them back to the trial courts. But by that time, I had left just in time. So I just slipped through the cracks and did not have to send anybody to jail for that crime.
There's so much more. I mean, we've barely touched the iceberg of the immense stories in this book, and we haven't even touched upon your incredible work on the Constitution and the years of teaching that you've done. Like you said, the vein through your career, which you've done so many different things, has been to seek justice. And that comes through loud and clear in this book. I'm so glad that you put this down on paper, because I will say, I've read your other books. I've followed a lot of your different classes and where you've spoken. I didn't know this about your background. I didn't know you were this, for lack of a better word, a complete badass of a prosecutor. So I'm very glad that you put this down in writing, because it is thoughtful. It comes with the benefit of hindsight, of being able to see what has happened, by the way, with a lot of the corruption that had been happening. There's incredible hope in a very, dark area. Prosecutors have to see kind of the worst of humanity, and you bring a lot of hope and light to these reflections. You guys have got to read this. Go out and get it. It's out. You can get it anywhere. It's Felony Review, Tales of True Crime and Corruption. Randy, I think you've said it, not me. Real stories, and the real stories you detail here are way more interesting than any true crime story that anyone can watch on TV or listen to on podcasts, because these facts are riveting in and of themselves, and you lived them. And I really appreciate you writing them down for the rest of us to learn from and to read as well.
Well, thank you so much for those kind words, Alice. Yes, one of the sub-themes of the book is better than TV. I was so afraid that after wanting to do this since I was 10 years old that I'd be disappointed when I got into the actual criminal justice system, but it was better than TV. And until The Wire or something, they just have not even tried to show us what it was really like. And they generally don't show us what it's really like. And what it's really like is more interesting. And I do think my one, recommendation to people who might want to go into this job is that if this is your passion, stick to your guns, because it actually is an extremely rewarding experience that you can have.
So before we let you go, I have to ask you one more question. What is more stressful, arguing in front of the Supreme Court or the first time you had to stand up in misdemeanor court?
That was a very strange day that I had to stand up in misdemeanor court. That was incredible. But I have never done anything as frightening as arguing in the Supreme Court of the United States. Nothing comes close. For 6 weeks building up to, I argued the medical marijuana case, Gonzalez v. Raich. It's the only case I've argued in the Supreme Court, although I was one of the lawyers challenging the Affordable Care Act. I happily was not one of the lawyers arguing that case. I argued the Raich case. The pressure was enormous. For 6 weeks building up, I said to my wife, I understand how people get ulcers in high-stress jobs, because that acid was in the pit of my stomach for 6 weeks. As I talk about in A Life for Liberty, I tell this whole story in A Life for Liberty. The night before the argument, I was having dinner with my best friend, and who was there for the weekend. We were in D.C. I was on the faculty at Boston University, and we went out to dinner. I said, Larry, I said, if I'm as nervous tomorrow as I am today, it's not going to be good for our case. And he said, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. I said, well, okay. So I get up the next morning, and I'm not really nervous. I said, okay, well, I haven't gone to the court. When I get to the building, I'll get nervous. When I got to the building, I wasn't really that nervous. And then I said, well, when I get to the lawyer's lounge where they give you the orientation, then I'll get nervous. And I got there and I really wasn't nervous. So I guess when I get in the courtroom, I'm going to get nervous. I got in the courtroom. I felt pretty okay. And I was nervous, but I was the good nervous. I was the kind of nervous you are. And I remembered feeling from being up in front of a jury, giving a closing argument or giving an opening statement, that kind of nervous. You don't want to be too calm. You do want to have adrenaline. You do want to have your system flowing. But I was not that nervous. And I think it's because I was prepared. I felt prepared, and the last 6 weeks had prepared me for that. And in fact, I think I had a pretty good day. I lost the case 6-3, although we beat the spread. Nobody expected us to get 3 votes. And I could tell that I was doing okay. And you can listen to the oral argument on oyes.org if you're interested. I could tell I was doing okay because there's a clock over the justice's bench that you look at. And if that clock is going really slow and you're looking up there and go, when is this going to end? Then you're doing badly. But if that clock is like sailing by and you're thinking, God, I'm not going to get all my points in, then you're doing pretty well. And I did pretty well on a hostile bench. And it was hostile because the only people that asked me questions were of the 6 who voted against my client. And the 3 that voted for me, Chief Justice Rehnquist was not present because of his cancer. And Justice O'Connor, for whatever reason, didn't ask me any questions. And Justice Thomas in those days never asked questions. So I got none of those helpful questions that advocates
You only got the hot bench.
I just got the hot ones. And I think I held my own for a guy who'd only done it once. But I aspire never to do it again. And I was, I sat through 3 days of the oral arguments in the Affordable Care Act, the Obamacare case, and not one part of me wished I was up there doing it instead of Paul Clement and Greg Katzis and the rest.
So when you argue at the Supreme Court, you get a feather that is given to each advocate. Where's your feather?
Well, I grabbed mine and I grabbed the one next to mine. So I have 2 feathers. And
even better.
They're both mounted crosswise under a blown up picture of the CNN artist rendering of me arguing the case, and they're hanging in my office at Georgetown.
That's awesome.
That is awesome. And I agree with you. Most advocates never get to argue at the Supreme Court. And I can think of no more stressful situation than arguing in that case, that case as well, before the Supreme Court. I have heard the oral argument. It's been years now. You did fantastic. But this is what I mean, guys, when you don't understand just how lucky we are to have spoken the last hour with Professor Barnett. He was a Cook County ADA, and he's argued at the Supreme Court, and he teaches at one of the preeminent law schools now. There's so much to learn from him. This is one of many books you could get from him, and you should check them all out. Professor Barnett, before we sign off, do you have any last words about anything? The floor is yours now. You've given us an hour of your time. You get to say whatever you want.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's been a great life. I basically wrote these memoirs first and foremost for my grandchildren, who by the time they grow up are not going to hear my stories, or not all of them anyway. And so I wanted to make sure they could hear them. And then it turns out other people were interested. And you have no idea, after having spent years writing both of these books, and this is a spinoff of the first one, you have no idea how wonderful it is to hear you, Alice, tell me this about the book, because it means all this work was worthwhile, that this isn't just an ego trip that I got to, tell my story, but I got to tell a story that would be of benefit to other people, which was, in fact, the purpose of having written it in the first place. So you've actually done me a great favor, but not only by having me on your podcast, but by sort of vindicating my decision to actually invest the time and effort in producing Felony Review, Tales of True Crime and Corruption in Chicago.
Well, thank you for spending your time with us. Thank you for writing this book. You guys check it out. Again, you can buy it anywhere there are books. Felony Review, Tales of True Crime and Corruption. Randy Barnett, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you for this past hour. We hope that you'll come back on for your next book, or anytime you want to come talk, you are always welcome. But until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is The Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Oh, I have to think of a descriptor for you now, Brett. Okay, we do have. It's a very short sign on, and
as far as time constraints, do you have any time constraints?
No, that was actually I forgot to ask. How long do you like this to go?
45 minutes.
45 minutes or so, if that's okay with you.
That's perfect. It's perfect.
All right. And I know you're not going to hold back on stories, so don't hold back on stories.
One thing that I actually. And that is, there is a surprise ending to the book. If you've read the book,
yeah, we won't spoil the ending.
We won't.
Welcome to Pluto Phone. If you know the name of the movie you'd like to see, just stream it for free on Pluto TV, where all your blockbuster favorites are landing all summer long. Catch Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy.
Fantastic.
Men in Black, 1 through 3.
That's what I'm talking about.
Mean Girls.
Shut up.
Titanic.
I'm the king of the world!
And so much more. For Showtime's Press Nothing. They're free 24/7.
That is so fetch.
On Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.